Good morning. Welcome to the Spring Meetings Dialogues. This annual series, new, has been launched by the Atlantic Council's Africa Center on the occasion of the 2022 IMF and World Bank Spring Meetings. The purpose is to raise the African voices during these strategic gatherings around the development matters and advance the African agenda in Washington, D.C., in a critical period marked by the post-COVID challenges and the economic consequences of the war in Ukraine. As you know, the Council is a platform for a better knowledge of Africa and for the promotion of opportunities on the African continent. During this key week, the Africa Center has hosted Scott Nathan, the new US CEO of the Development Finance Corporation, African officials like yesterday Minister of Finances from Zambia or the Prime Minister of Congo. Today, we are delighted to welcome Dr. Akinwumi Adesina, President of the African Development Bank Group. Mr. President, you are a globally renowned development economist and agricultural development expert with more than 30 years of international experience. You have been first elected 8th President of the African Development Bank Group in 2015 and re-elected for a second 5-year term in 2020. Prior to this position, you have been Minister of Agriculture of your country, Nigeria, from 2011 to 2015. Prior to this appointment as Minister of Agriculture, you were the Vice President, Policy and Partnerships of the Alliance for a Green Revolution in Africa, where you led several innovative policy and finance initiatives that leveraged over 4 billion in bank finance commitments to Africa's agriculture sector. You also served as Associate Director and Regional Director for the Southern Africa Office of the Rockefeller Foundation for over a decade. Mr. President Adesina, welcome at the Atlantic Council.
Thank you very much. It's good to be here, Ambassador.
Thank you. My first question, Dr. Adesina, is about your visit here in Washington, D.C. What are your expectations with the Bretton Woods institutions? Can you tell us more about the meetings, including the bilateral meetings with U.S. officials?
Well, first, let me say how delighted I am to be here with you at the Atlantic Council. And thank you for the great work that you do, Ambassador, with all of your colleagues here. In your introductory remarks, you did say it, to give a voice, the voice of Africa to be heard very loud and clearly, and also the challenges and the opportunities, I must say, that Africa has to offer. So thank you for the platform that you have whenever we all get here in Washington to engage. Now, I'm here in Washington, of course, is on this, for the World Bank and the IMF annual meetings. And since we have ministers in finance from all over the world, it's always a great time to discuss global economic challenges, to also look at financial issues that might be coming up, issues of debt. And particularly at this particular time is the issue that is grabbing everybody's attention is the whole issue of the war in Ukraine, Russia's war in Ukraine, and what that means for the rest of the world. So I'm here in Washington to discuss those particular issues, but also I'm here to meet with U.S. senior government officials, U.S. Treasury Department, to talk about the African Development Fund 16th replenishment, which is going to be, we've already started that process this year, but also to meet with ministers of finance from all across Africa to explain to them the new challenges that are now arising out of this war in Ukraine, also to look at the solutions as well for how we're going to expand financing for Africa. So discussing with the IMF again about the special drawing rights and how we might use that more optimally to drive development. But of course, we'll be also meeting with private sector leaders to talk about investments in Africa. And of course, I've had great meetings at the White House talking about U.S. investments in Africa and support in particular for the strategies that we have in place to mitigate the impact of this, the contagion impact of this war in Africa.
It's a tight agenda. Maybe we can start with talking about the first challenge the African economies are still facing, unfortunately, the COVID-19 consequences. For the recovery from the COVID-19 crisis, African countries still need financial support. And we noticed the additional external financing requested should be more than 800 billion between 2022 and 2025. Are you still optimistic on that? Where do you stand about these requests or goals? What about your options with the potential donors?
Well, you know, the COVID-19 situation has kind of really upended a lot of things for everybody globally because, you know, prior to COVID-19, you know, Africa had 6 of the 10 fastest growing economies in the world, you know. But with COVID-19, the economies of Africa suffered perhaps one of the lowest economic growth rates we've witnessed. You know, GDP growth rate declined by minus 1.5%. You know, because of the economic lockdowns, because of the collapse of commodity prices, and also tourism kind of really countries couldn't really make money out of tourism. But of course, it also created a huge amount of impacts on populations. We got 26 to 30 million people that fell into poverty. We lost 30 million jobs in Africa. So a lot of impacts. But what we did at the bank was we put forward a crisis response facility for $10 billion to support countries to deal with many of these impacts. And in fact, we launched at the time a $3 billion social impact bond on the global capital markets, which was at the time the largest ever social impact bond ever launched in world history. So we were very, very proactive in dealing with this particular issue. But there are 3 lessons that we must learn from that particular things for Africa. First is the fact that Africa should no longer ever, you know, give the health security of its 1.3 billion people just depend on the benevolence of others. Yeah. The second is that, you know, we must also look at health investments in a very, very critical way because it was a health sector driven, a health driven a challenge that led to serious economic and financial issues. So therefore, in my view, we need to have a health defense system for Africa that will have 3 components. One is invest in vaccines, invest in pharmaceutical industry, but also invest in quality health infrastructure. Of course, a lot more money will still continue to be needed to cope with this, and in particular because of what it meant for the debt situation for many of the countries. There are a number of efforts being done, and we can talk about those ones, but I do think that at the end of the day, economies are getting turned around now. We have projected this year 5.1% GDP growth rate. So as tourism comes back, commodity prices have also gone up. So I think we need to make sure, though, that African countries still have the fiscal space to be able to deal with some of the debt challenges, which have actually been quite significant as a result of that crisis.
Yeah, your answer is so complete, Dr. Adesina, that you have answered my additional questions in advance about the long-term answer, you know, on the health front. But just would like to add one quick question about the outcomes of the vaccination diplomacy. We all know about Gavi, the Gavi system, the solidarity claimed by Western countries to Africa. But how did you appreciate that vaccination diplomacy and the initiatives taken in the African continent to create a new, new solutions, innovative solutions on that front? How did you appreciate that?
Well, you know, my basic principle of development is that Africa shouldn't be begging, right? Yeah. And Africa should actually put itself in a situation where it can, you know, solve a lot of its own challenges by itself. If you have help, that's fine, but you don't depend on others just because of that. And you saw that with the vaccine situation, where Africa's needs were not prioritized at all. I mean, the developed countries all, basically bought up all the vaccines and stockpiled even for 3 times what they actually need. And Africa at the time, you know, wasn't getting more than 2% of the global supply of vaccines and so on. Today, when you talk about the issue of vaccinations on the diplomacy side, you know, you have on the continent roughly about 16% of the population now that has been vaccinated. I mean, when I say that, I mean in terms of full vaccinations for 2 doses. Yeah. But you have about almost 22% of the population with at least, let me say, one dose. But here's the point, Ambassador. while the rest of the world, I'm sure if I ask you how many vaccine shots you have, I'm sure you have a booster shots and all that. While everybody is getting booster shots, Africa is struggling to have basic shots.
Yeah.
And so that really tells me that the issue is Africa itself needs to begin to manufacture vaccines. Today, Africa imports 99% of its vaccines. It's not just COVID-19. You have several other epidemiological challenges that Africa has, and that we must be able to produce our vaccines to deal with that. And secondly, what this also shows me is that investing in R&D matters. In Africa, we're not investing so much in R&D. So share of our GDP is very, very low compared to developed countries. But it's only through research and innovation that you come up with technologies ahead of time. So you got to be ahead of time. So you don't see the benefits immediately, but you have to keep investing a lot in that. And lastly, what I wanted to also say on this is the whole issue with regard to what the African leaders have done. I want to applaud the African Union Commission. President Ramaphosa really led a lot of this with the African Union in terms of the response to be able to buy the vaccines and get that to Africa. Now, but the issue now is, how are we going to produce our own vaccines? And here the African Development Bank, our board just approved for us a while ago, the launch of what we call the Africa Pharmaceutical Investment for the bank. We're going to put in $3 billion into pharmaceutical production, but also manufacturing, but also into vaccine production. So all that to say that at the end of the day, your neighbor may love you a lot, but they're not going to send your kid to school.
Yeah, and it's good to stress that it's not only because of the young population and the sun that Africans did better than expected, but because there was interesting and very bold and strong policies at the very beginning. So thank you for reminding that. I'd like to talk about another challenge, more recent, the consequences of the Russia war in Ukraine. And the economic consequences on the African continent, with a very general question. What African countries are facing the most challenging situations regarding the growing wheat and oil prices related to that war? Where are the most difficult situations on the continent?
Well, I think for me, the most difficult thing is heart-wrenching nature of the war that I see. It's not just about, I'm not just so worried about the impact in Africa, which of course I'm going to talk about, but how about the Ukrainians? How about their children? How about the people? How about the communities? I mean, each time I turn on the television and I see that, for me as a father, as a grandfather, it is very heart-wrenching. This is a war that needs to stop, because it's not just about economic issues, about financial issues, about life issues. So I really do hope that we focus on that and make sure that this actually ends. Having said that, I think that the issue here is to look at the broader contagion effects that this has actually had. Check, for example, the impact it has had on food production, food security globally. Now, look at the price, Ambassador, of wheat. The price of wheat has gone up by about 64% more globally. If you look at Africa, maybe average about 45% in terms of price of wheat. The price of maize has also gone up, of soybeans, of rice has gone up. And don't forget, not too long ago, we had the Arab Spring that came out of a food crisis, ignited in Tunisia. And so that is a problem. The second is that Africa depends a lot on Russia and Ukraine for supply of food. For example, out of the basically $4 billion that Russia exports to Africa, total value of export to Africa, 90% of that is actually for wheat. And if you take Ukraine, probably about of the $4.5 billion of exports to Africa, almost 55% of that, 54% of that is for wheat, and 31% of it is for maize. Now, the West Africa, I mean, not even West Africa, but it's Eastern Africa region, everything is maize. Everything is ugali, everything is even Southern Africa. Well, the point is, in Eastern Africa region, 90% of all their cereals come from these two countries. So you can imagine that is going to be a big impact. The second impact, which is going to be very serious, is fertilizers. The price of fertilizers have gone up by about 300%. And access to fertilizer becomes a constraining factor. And in fact, today, Africa has a deficit because it imports a lot of those, about roughly almost 2 million tons. So we got to be able to deal with that. So what we are doing at the African Development Bank is how do we respond to that? You know, I mean, when you started with COVID-19. When COVID-19 started, we didn't have the capacity. We didn't have the testing kits. We didn't have the manufacturing capacity for vaccines. But this time for agriculture, you know, you were introducing me at the start.
You know,
we're pretty ready. You know, that's why at the bank we designed what's called the African Emergency Food Production Plan. That's the reason why I'm in Washington discussing this with the highest levels of authorities here.
You know,
to see how to use that to avert a looming food crisis in Africa.
So you don't fear that the donors prioritize Ukraine at the expense of African nations, for example?
Well, I think that first and foremost is that we ourselves are putting our monies where our mouth really is. This plan that I mentioned to you, Ambassador, is to put in $1.5 billion into producing food. And that will produce about 38 million metric tons of food. Today, the gap that Africa will lose in terms of this war is about 30 million metric tons of food. So we can produce 38 million metric tons of food over 2 years that will cope with that particular gap. And the thing is, we're looking at the commodities that matter. We're looking at wheat. We're looking at about roughly 11 million metric tons of wheat. We're looking at 18 million metric tons of maize, 6 million metric tons of rice, and about 2.5 million metric tons of soybeans. So all in all, we have the technology. We have the delivery platform. So many of the things that we've been doing at the bank, supporting through a platform called Technologies for African Agricultural Transformation, that is actually delivering technologies to, you know, maybe 12 million farmers today. So we know what to do, and we will put $1 billion of our money into this. It's in front of our board, but we are raising $500 million from others, and so it's one of the key things that I'm discussing here with the U.S. Treasury and other leaders in Washington.
Thank you very much, Dr. Adesina. I would like to ask you another question related to food insecurity. We could spend more time on agribusiness, etc., but we have to.
I love agriculture, you know.
Yeah, I know that, so that's why I prefer to be careful here and move forward on an issue related to agriculture issues. It's about climate. A few days ago, the Africa Center hosted the Vice President of Nigeria on the occasion of the launch of our Inclusive Africa Climate Working Group. Our target is the next COP27 on the African continent in Egypt. And here we would like African voices to be more heard, of course. Something different from Glasgow. I would like to ask you if, what's your look on what happened in Glasgow? Because for many Africans it was a failure, and even for others. We know that Africans are only responsible of 4% of emissions, of gas emissions, but they pay the highest price of it. So do you have, as African, as president of the African Development Bank, as leader, a specific strategy to be more productive or better heard in Egypt than Africans were in Glasgow?
Well, you know, as I said in the beginning, typically my philosophy is not to beg. My philosophy is to raise issues, and it's all about mutual accountability, especially for things that happens to us globally in the global commons, right? That we are all accountable for that. So if you take, for example, you know, just look at what happened in South Africa. And my heart goes to the people of South Africa and President Ramaphosa as he deals with that in KwaZulu-Natal, so many hundreds of people that died. But that is a daily occurrence for us in Africa. From droughts in the Sahel, from droughts in the East Africa, in Southern Africa region, from locusts, you know, biblical type of locust invasions that we are having all over the place. In Mozambique, you see what happened with the cyclones there, Idea and all of those. Just billions of dollars of investment that are lost and lives of people that are lost. So as you said, Africa accounts for no more than 3-4% of global greenhouse gas emissions, but suffers disproportionately from the negative impacts of that. Today, right, 9 out of the 10, you know, according to the Global Vulnerability Index, 9 out of the 10 most vulnerable countries to climate change are in Africa. And incidentally, 100% of those are actually the African Development Fund, low-income and transition state countries. So the issue is, first, before I talk about what others need to do for Africa, let me say what we are doing for ourselves. You know, at the African Development Bank, we have doubled our support for climate to $25 billion by 2025. That's the first thing. Second, the challenge in Africa is really about climate adaptation, because we didn't cause the problem, we've got to adapt to it. So, but the resources to adapt to it is the challenge. And what we've done, the UN Secretary General asked that everybody puts in 50% in terms of mitigation, climate mitigation, and 50% in terms of adaptation. Well, the African Development Bank has gone way ahead of that. Today, 67% of all of our climate finance goes to adaptation, right? And that is the highest we find of any multilateral development bank in the world, right? So we're basically helping countries with that, whether it is paying for insurance for them to insure themselves against catastrophic risk events, whether it is giving them access to climate resilient technologies for their farmers at scale of helping them to build climate resilient infrastructure. Now we have also launched something, myself with the former UN Secretary General, Ban Ki-moon, and it's called the Global Center for Adaptation. We have a program called the African Adaptation Acceleration Program. It is to mobilize $25 billion to support climate adaptation in Africa, and that's the African plan, and it has been very well received. Now, having said that, there are three issues that are very important for us when we talk about the issue of Glasgow. First is that Africa's needs must be heard. You know, we don't think climate change, we live in it every single day, and so there's a need for urgent support for Africa. Now, the issue is promises made must be promises kept. I remember my mentor, late mentor, Kofi Annan, used to tell me, Akin, the only promises that matter are the promises that are kept. You know, when developed countries actually said that they were going to provide $100 billion of support per year for developing countries to adapt to climate change, right? That still remains a promise. That still needs to be met. And that's one of the disappointments out of Glasgow, as much as it was really very good meeting to talk about things. So going to Sharm el-Sheikh, you know, the $100 billion commitment needs to be on the table, right, for countries. The other thing that needs to be done for Glasgow is also to recognize that the amount of money we actually need to deal with this climate thing is more than $100 billion a year. So the private sector needs to be a key part of it. We must be talking about trillions of dollars to green economies and so on. So for us, again, at the African Development Bank, we have something called the African Financial Alliance for Climate that is bringing together the stock exchanges, the central banks, and the commercial banks to mobilize capital and direct the economy in a way that is green. That is fundamental to doing that. And talking about energy, you know, one of the things that you hear quite a lot about in Glasgow was how do you do energy transition, right? Now, well, you can have zero, you can have support that people want to have to net zero, right? But you can't have net zero with zero financing. You need to have the monies to be able to do it. And so we are working right now with the G7 countries, and I want to applaud them for the $8.5 billion they put out for South Africa in terms of doing that energy transition. But what South Africa actually needs is $27 billion. So the African Development Bank is quite bold again. We've designed the development of what we call the Africa Just Energy Transition Facility, which will be at the African Development Bank, but help to use innovative ways to mobilize monies for South Africa to raise the $27 billion it needs to make its energy transition from depending on coal to renewable energy. So all that to say, Sharm el-Sheikh is, for us in Africa, a reality moment. Everything has to come together. But we are prepared ourselves, but I think the rest of the world has to fulfill its commitments to Africa.
Yeah, you're right. We will be there with you to follow that important gathering. But now I would like to leave the floor to my colleagues here. Okay. We are very aligned with your willingness to change the narrative about Africa. And my colleagues here are going to talk with you to have a dialogue around the new African markets that can represent a new African leadership. So I would like to introduce you to my colleague Aubrey Ruby. She's an Africa Center Senior Fellow and our lead on economic issues. And she's also an important actor of investment in Africa. Aubrey.
Oh, my pleasure. And let me extend my welcome, Dr. Adesina, for you joining us today. You know, when you took your position in 2015, you drilled into all of our heads the high five.
Yes.
We went around high-fiving at all the meetings, all the conferences. And in 2015, Those high five really spoke to so many of the issues, and they still speak relevant today. But I'm looking at the emergence of the tech sector in Africa. And if we look at 2015, there was about $350 million invested in venture capital and tech in the region. And this past year, it passed $4 billion. And so I'm wondering, how do you adapt your high five into thinking about this tech revolution? And what is the bank doing to ensure that this next generation of African entrepreneurs has support and engages with the bank instead of seeing it as an old institution?
Well, we are certainly an old institution, but a very active and solutions-driven institution. First is the high fives. I'm glad you still remember the high fives. The high five of the bank, I am so proud of it because, when the United Nations Development Program did its own independent analysis, but what they found was that if Africa achieved all those high fives, and I'll say it, like to light up and power Africa, to feed Africa, to integrate Africa, to industrialize Africa, and to improve the quality of life of the people of Africa, that Africa would have achieved 90% of the Sustainable Development Goals and 90% of the Agenda 2063. So I had the honor of actually speaking to all the African heads of state at the summit, the Heads of Ordinary Summit in February this year. And they got to hear and feel the impact of what we've done with the high fives. In the last 5 years, it has impacted on the lives of 335 million people, including 20 million people that we connected to electricity, roughly almost 75 million people with access to technology for agriculture, and many more that I can say. But coming back to the issue of the young people, as I go around in Africa, I hear people say the young people are the future of Africa. Well, I think that future is too far. They are the now of Africa. And it's Africa's biggest asset, which is the demographic asset. It has to be turned into an economic and wealth asset in terms of youth-based wealth. And in fact, the African Development Bank has been really supporting the enablers for that. When you talk about fintech, you don't do fintech without having digital infrastructure, right?
Correct. So
you do need to have...
And energy.
And so we've been investing in energy, we've been investing in digital infrastructure. The East Africa submarine cable was done by the African Development Bank. The Trans-Sahara digital infrastructure was built by us. In Central Africa, fiber optics network was done by us, which we need to be able to have access to broadband to do many of this. And I'm so proud of the young people in Africa today. I was looking at, take the case of Johannesburg, from Kenya to Lagos in Nigeria, the Yabacon, they have it. You have Flutterwave, you have, InterSwitch, all these companies now that are, worth $3 billion, Flutterwave, and that is the future. But what are we doing at the bank to even build further on that? When I go around, people tell me they're empowering young people. Well, it's okay, but I guess sometimes all I see are the people who say they're empowering the young people, just empowering themselves. Young people don't tell me that, right? And so they don't need handouts, they need investment. What we need is youth-based investment. And that's why at the African Development Bank, we decided that we're now working to establish what is called youth entrepreneurship investment banks. These will be new financial institutions when designed, and we expect to finish that design by June this year. That will be full-fledged institution that we will help capitalize. The central banks of Africa will help capitalize.
On a countrywide basis or regional?
Oh, no, these are all country-based, right? And they are going to be institutions in which the young people will walk in and they will not be seen as risk. They will be seen as asset, right? But what is also important is the range of instruments that they will have. They will have instruments from grants. They will have instruments from concessional financing or blended finance. They will have instruments in terms of guarantees to guarantee the young people so that you de-risk their lending to them.
Yeah.
But what we make these institutions already so different is that they will invest in the life cycle of their businesses. So it's not just a spot transaction today.
Absolutely.
So you start your business, you grow, you get access to grants, you get access to technical assistance.
And the working capital, that's what I hear a lot.
And equity.
Yeah.
It's what is very unique. It's not just a working capital, but as your business grows, right, you need to be handheld that these banks will invest in their businesses as they go. That makes it very, very different.
Yeah.
Because I really believe that it's time to move to youth-based wealth. in Africa. So we must create that ecosystem, and the bank is leading on that.
And it's happening in so many ways. You know, I was in Lagos in October at a wonderful new restaurant, and I looked out and I could see the old money and I could see the new tech money. And it's happening, and they invest in each other too. That's what's so amazing. But in this same process, I see a real overlap with the creative industries. Yeah. You know, we're talking about Web3, crypto natives, and Africa is going to be full of crypto natives. Your country, Nigeria, is one of the largest user of crypto. And in this world where anyone can create and put it on the internet, you know, how are we going to think about the creative industries as a driver of employment in Africa?
Well, you know, the creative industry it's all about ideas, right? And the creative industry is very, 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 very wide. There is, of course, the creative part of the fintech industry, the cryptocurrency. This is important, and I think the time for that has come. And central banks are all looking into how to have digital currencies and things like that. But let's also talk about Africa's culture. Mm-hmm. You know, you have
global.
It's gone global. And you look, for example, also at the media. You know, in Nigeria, where you were talking about, you know, Nollywood in Nigeria today is the second globally, mm-hmm. right? And in Nigeria, it probably gives contributes about almost $8 billion to the GDP of Nigeria. It's still small, about 1.4%, but it's very, very important. But what's notable is when you find Netflix investing $8 billion in Nollywood. That tells you where that is. And we had the Africa Investment Forum recently, and one of the things that we actually saw was the huge, you know, as a guy in Nigeria, in Ghana, they want to set up film academies in which Africa will have its own film academies to train people and to be able to take advantage of this creative industry. Now, this creative industry has the potential to create about 20 million jobs. And so we need to make sure that it's well financed. And one last thing I'll say is that, you know, I like fashion, and at the bank we have a program called Fashionomics, right, the economics of fashion. And this is very important, especially for women, because the whole issue of moving from cotton to textile to garments and empowering women who dominate this space, it's very, very important. So all that to say that, you know, Africa has ideas, Africa has creativity, Africa has young people that are very, very talented. And that's the biggest thing in Africa. Now we got to get the financing to unlock all of that, and that's where we are.
Yeah, and that's infinite, right?
Yeah.
The best thing about the creative industries is they're non-rival goods.
That's right.
Which means, you know, you make a song in Nigeria, you can listen to it there, and it can be listened to in Washington, D.C. at the same time. And I, you know, recently turned on Netflix. I see a new show called Young, Rich, and African. And, you know, it's a whole series.
Have you watched that?
And so, you know, this is a revolution. And we were in Dakar for the launch of the second season of the Basketball Africa League.
Oh, yeah.
And I know you guys have been engaged in that as well.
But that one, you know, I must say, the ambassador, you know, there are many things I'm passionate about. But when we're talking about the issue of basketball, Masai Ujiri to Toronto Raptors is doing a great job really doing this. And but Mutombo, who is
the
became, you know,
all of them were in Dakar for our event.
Exactly, but I like to dream big, so I decided to take Mutombo on a basketball, you know, pick and roll game. Yeah, you know, he's 7'2", and
that is ambition. That is ambition.
Right? But what I decided to do is I try to move around him, and I try to take a 3-point shot.
You got to go under.
No, you know, his voice is very deep.
Oh, he talks.
So he told me as I was trying to dribble, he said, "President, welcome to the Mutombo no-fly zone." and as I tried to do the ball, you know, he's 7'2", he just collected the ball from me, went about and he dumped it. So, but at least I showed ambition.
But
and boldness.
That's a great
this moment is fantastic, but the time is running, and Julian needs to speak.
Yes,
so just you can maybe.
No. I guess my last question there, and I'm glad you brought up Mutombo and others, is the role of the diaspora. Oh, yes. You know, the African Union sees the African diaspora as the 6th region. Mm-hmm. And so how does the bank reach out to the diaspora, say in the US, and many of our viewers here today?
Well, you know, the diaspora actually has some of Africa's best talents. We're just talking about Masai Ujiri, Mutombo. These are the people that are also there in the sports side. But you also have, you know, huge capacity, whether it's in media, whether it is in the finance sector, all over in medicine, all over academics, all over Africa. So there is the knowledge asset part that I think contribute to Africa. The second part of it is the remittances that actually come to Africa, quite significant for all the countries. But the issue is most of those goes to things like social investments, like education for water and things like that, and health.
Consumption.
Yeah. Consumption, basically. However, at the African Development Bank, we're looking at how to be able to securitize a lot of this so that we can actually turn them into investment in critical infrastructure. We still have a big gap on infrastructure. So how do we get the diaspora to invest in that? And finally is that we've got to make it easier for diaspora capital to flow into Africa, make it easier for them to get access to land, make it easier for them to do transactions. That is how you make the connection. So the diaspora is very important. Many countries are now having even either special envoys or ministers for the diaspora because it's now become a big part of many of our economies with remittances.
And what I appreciate in Washington since I arrived here as a member of the African-European diaspora is that I noticed so many people from the Nigerian diaspora in the Biden administration, for example, at the Congress and everywhere. So, which means that they are really successful. But I would like to give the floor to our friend Julian Pequet, who is a Washington and UN correspondent in Washington D.C. For Africa Report and Jeune Afrique l'Intelligent. Unfortunately, we are going to go back to the previous issues. Less entertainment and more about budget and everything. But maybe, Julian, you can engage the dialogue with Dr. Adesina, please.
Yes, thank you very much for having us, and thank you, President, for coming. You talked about your basic principle of development that Africa should be begging, and you talked about it in the context of the vaccines and climate. I was wanting to talk to you about it in the context of global international financial support. There was much to do about the $650 billion allocation of IMF special drawing rights. I think it was their largest ever to help countries cope with the COVID crisis. At the same time, there's been quite a lot of criticism, right? For one thing, I think it took like almost a year to happen. Africa only got 5%. As a result of that, G20 countries pledged to reallocate around $100 billion of that to Africa. But only $36 billion, I believe, has been pledged so far. So I was hoping to talk to you a little bit about, your conversations while you're here, both in terms of making sure that those pledges come through. You talked about how pledges are not worth much until they're actually delivered. So where are you on that? Is there a request for more SDR allocations beyond the $650 billion? And also, more broadly, changing the whole makeup of how these SDRs are allocated. I know that there's a proposal going around, for example, that the Afreximbank be one of the prescribed holder. So I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about, your conversations with the IMF and Western partners on all of these things and how that's going.
Thanks very much, Julian. I think the first is, let me commend the Secretary Yellen of Treasury for actually being very bold off the block in terms of calling for the special issuance of the special drawing rights. I think having $630 billion of issuance of special drawing rights, which is the largest that IMF has ever done, it's a great thing. It has helped a lot of the countries to deal with. Many of them were facing balance of payment issues, they were facing liquidity issues, so it has really helped to do that and also stabilize the currencies because many of them were facing lack of forex which led to currency depreciation in many of the countries, driving up inflation in many of those places. So very, very good thing. Now, as you know, and as you rightly said, Africa got $33 billion of that. Now, African heads of state have asked for at least $100 billion to be allocated to Africa. But also President Macron has, we had the conference in Paris in which he called for that. And recently at the African Union Summit, the African heads of state reiterated their call for at least $100 billion to come to Africa. But they were very specific that they want that reallocation, a big part of that reallocation, to go through the African Development Bank. And there's a reason for that. First is the current thing that you have right now, and I want to commend my dear sister, Kristalina Georgieva, for her leadership in what she's doing there at the IMF, but also in terms of the funds that they've set up, which is the Poverty Reduction and Growth Trust at the IMF, but also at the Resilience and Sustainability Trust, in which SDRs are going to go to, which is very, very good. Now, we have at the African Development Bank been making the case that SDRs, special drawing rights, should also be given to the multilateral development banks. You know, we are leveraging machines as multilateral development banks. You know, as much as the PRH, the trusts at IMF are good, PRGT and RST, remember it's a one-to-one transaction there. But for every dollar you give us with the SDR at the multilateral development bank, we can, at the African Development Bank, leverage that 3 to 4 times. So a $10 billion allocation becomes at least up to about $40 billion just like that for African countries. So that leveraging, I think, is very, very important. Secondly, is that we should, in my view, turn the SDRs from just being a static instrument, right, to being a very, very dynamic and catalytic instrument for wider economic growth and development. Because that's the whole idea. It's not just the central bank. You know, the fact that you have money in the central bank doesn't actually get a child to school. It doesn't fix infrastructure. It doesn't get lights running. It doesn't get people food, right? And that's what we really want to do when you were talking there about the whole issue of global commons that we all have. So we have to make sure that we use it in that particular way. Now, we've been talking about this for quite some time, but the challenges are quite a few. First is that for the European countries, it's challenging for them because of the European Central Bank issues in terms of prohibition of financial or using their financing from their central banks outside of the Eurozone, right? So I talked to Madame Lagarde about that, and we're looking for that, but it's a challenge that they have. We had to find a solution for that. The other one is the special drawing rights have to have maintained. Those that want to do it and give us some of this have asked the question, it has to have a reserve asset quality must be assured, right? And also that whenever they want to call it back, so with the encashment issue, you got to be able to call it whenever you need it. Those are the things. So the liquidity and the quality of that, it's very, very important. Now, I have a great team at the bank, and they've been working so hard. We're working together with the Bank of America and Merrill Lynch to design ways in which we think we have models now that answers that issue of the reserve asset quality, but also the issue with regard to the liquidity part of it. So we continue to have that conversations. We are having a lot of positive interest in this, but we want to make sure that we present options that will give the comfort for this to be done. I think that we can even use the SDRs to support what Ambassador was mentioning to me about the whole issue of the food crisis, because you can invest it to help to trigger structural change in agriculture. So those are the things that we are talking. It's a fascinating instrument, but we have to make it even more impactful.
Got it. Okay. I think we're running out of time here, so I will
very
take it back to the ambassador.
Please
go ahead.
If you have another question, just
can you talk to us a little bit then about your, the progress that you feel you've made? I understand you've probably had a number of meetings around this. Can you talk to us a little bit about who you met with around this issue during these past few days and sort of, where we are in the discussion?
Yeah, I met several ministers of finance. I spoke with the Minister of Finance from Norway. I met with the Minister of Finance the Director General of International Development for Ireland. I met with the Minister of International Development also from Sweden and several others. I was at the U.S. Treasury Department, in which there's a lot of, in each of these conversations, everybody understands and appreciates that this is something that we all will get better results of if we can make it to work. And so I was encouraged by my discussions at Treasury, and we continue to keep an open mind to that. And I think we've been talking to also several other countries, like Canada, for example, that are quite keen on looking at this quite possibly, if we can answer those, deal with those issues. France, for example, but also UK, in Saudi Arabia, and several others are willing to look at many of these things. So positive inclination towards that, but we continue to work on the technical questions.
Do you have any feelings about expanding the SDRs to other multilateral and especially African banks like the African Export-Import Bank?
Well, the thing is that when the African heads of state, by their resolution, they said the African, they reallocated SDR should go through the African Development Bank. There's a reason for that. First, African Development Bank is Africa's premier financial institution. Second, it is the only AAA rated financial institution in Africa. Third, It is the only one that can actually use that access to capital markets to bring in long-term financing that countries need. Fourth is that literally most of the financial institutions in Africa, including, by the way, the Afri-Exim Bank, were set up, were established by the African Development Bank. We gave them a few years ago $1 billion of investment into that bank, right? And so, but I want the Afri-Exim Bank to focus on its work, which is the issue of trade finance. We set it up to do trade finance, and it should do trade finance. And we've made a commitment to President Macron and also to the Agence Française de Développement as part of our financing in common that, and I told the heads of state this, that the SDRs that are reallocated to the African Development Bank we will help to recapitalize many of these financial institutions, which we set up anyway, right, including the Afri-Exim Bank. But I want everybody to stay in their lane because efficiency of use of capital is very important.
Okay. Thank you, President.
Thank you, Dr. Adesina. I think we are going to conclude now. Thank you very much. Just maybe one last question for you. In your visits on the African continent and in your experience as president of the African Development Bank, which country has impressed you the most in its ability to grow and serve its population in terms of development?
Ambassador, you
won't have problems with others. Just yeah. We would like to know about this narrative. What country could be a model for the?
Well,
others? Actually,
I think what I would say to you is that Africa is the model. We had the Africa Investment Forum.
A
right?
very diplomatic answer.
Yeah, we're an ambassador, and I'm an ambassador for Africa. Yeah, but in reality, what you find is that Africa is full of opportunities, right? All across, I see resilience. I see a lot of commitment to macroeconomic reforms. I see a lot of business regulatory environment improvements in many of the countries. We just had the Africa Investment Forum, right? Just in February. We were able to mobilize, roughly $32.8 billion in less than 72 hours. And so I can say that even in the most difficult countries where people call fragile states, the African Development Bank, we invest in those areas and they work. But let me try and say in closing, I want to say something about these countries, these low-income fragile states.
Yeah.
We are in the period of replenishment of the African Development Fund, which is the fund we use to support these countries.
Yes.
And it's a sustained replenishment. It's 50 years of this African Development Fund. And so we're looking forward to how to mobilize more resources for countries like Central African Republic, countries like Chad, for Mali, to Niger, for Burkina Faso, right? Now, these countries need more resources because they are more fragile, they have little resources, and very limited access to capital markets.
Yeah.
And what I want to say is, how can we help them to have more resources? I'm a grandfather, right? I got 3 grandkids, a 4th one on the way. But if I buy them a T-shirt, or you bought somebody a T-shirt in 1972, right? And the kid is now, let's say, in 2022, they can't be wearing the same T-shirt. So we are saying that it's time for the African Development Fund to use the equity it has. We have $25 billion of equity in the African Development Fund. But the fund be allowed, therefore, to use that to go to capital markets, and we can raise at least $33 billion. And that will provide for all these low-income countries at least $6 billion per replenishment cycle. So that is what I consider success, not just one country, but collective countries. That's 37 countries with more resources. Then we will drive greater growth, but more equitable growth for Africa. And that's what's most important.
You are developing mega projects, business projects, and that's very important in your work.
Yeah.
So thank you very much, Dr. Adesina. We always appreciate you coming here to see us. We had the chance to, we were lucky enough at the end of last year to host you from Abidjan for about our summit on African creative industries.
Right.
So thank you for being a friend of the Atlantic Council's Africa Center. We wish you good luck for the following steps of your critically important work. And we wish you all the best to you and your team. For us, we are closing our spring meetings dialogues this year. And we were very happy to host all these high-level representatives, guests, officials, heads of development institutions. So thank you, stay tuned, and see you next week.